the good old summertime, in the good old summertime.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Golden Age of Cricket podcast. My name is Tom Ford. There is perhaps no English cricketer who encapsulates the spirit of the Golden Age more than Gilbert Jessop, a wildly talented all-round amateur from Gloucestershire whose great improbable batting at the Oval during the 5th Test match of the 1902 Ashes not only won the match, but established a mythical-like status for himself and the age, which has only grown in reputation since. To this day, his match-winning century remains the quickest by an Englishman in Test cricket. A new book, Chasing Jessop, The Mystery of England Cricket's Oldest Record, has just been published and chronicles not only Jessop's colourful career, but forensically dissects one of the most famous individual feats in the history of the game. Simon Wilde has been cricket correspondent of the Sunday Times since 1998. He has written 12 books, 3 of which were shortlisted for the William Hill Sports Book of the Year. His most recent works have been the acclaimed England, the Biography, A History of the Men's National Team, and The Tour, which chronicles the England team's travels overseas since 1877, which won the MCC Cricket Society Book of the Year prize. He is a returning guest, having appeared on the podcast to discuss the life and times of Ranjit Singh, whose biography he also wrote. Simon, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Tom.
Congratulations on the new book. I had the privilege of reading it just before it was released, and it's riveting from cover to cover. It sort of unfolds like an adventure novel. Can I ask you what impelled you to write this book about Gilbert Jessop's great innings, and was it inspired by living and working in the era of baseball?
Well, yes, it was. The reason I wrote the book was because of baseball and because so many of these guys playing in the England team, the likes of Harry Brook and Ben Duckett, Crawley, and Johnny Bairstow, who's no longer in the team, all got so close to the Jessop record but have been unable to quite knock it off its perch. And that sort of sent me back to 1902 and to check how much we actually knew about this amazing feat. I mean, obviously, I was familiar with it up to a point, but it felt like it needed some further investigation because there was quite a bit of sort of chat about, is this record real? How much do we know about it? And could I check it out further? And I started looking, and I sort of got deeper and deeper into the sort of mystery of it, really, because there are no surviving scorebooks. They didn't used to record batsmen's innings ball by ball in the way they do today. And so it actually became a bit of a puzzle to work out what had happened.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating read, both in terms of the narrative, but what you've uncovered, and we'll get into that a bit later in terms of your own analysis of Jessop's innings. What comes across while reading the book is that really your prime resources in terms of the famous innings by Jessop are the local newspapers and some international newspapers as well. But you did actually also have some sources from Jessop's granddaughter, didn't you? Tell us about that connection and what she was able to provide.
But the story is Jessop was one of 12 children. He was the 11th of 12 children. And one of his sisters, Winifred, used to keep cuttings of Jessop's great feats. And she must have been quite busy because he did many amazing things in county cricket and less so for England, apart from the Oval, 1902. But anyone keeping cuttings on Jessop must have been busy because he was making headlines all the time, really.
Yes.
Anyway, Winifred's scrapbooks still survive. They're in the family, in the possession of the family. And so Jessop's granddaughter, Lucy Jessop, she lives in Ireland. She's a doctor. She sort of got these scrapbooks, and she sort of helped me at the start of the puzzle, really. I mean, I didn't actually ever go and see her, and so I haven't actually handled the scorebooks, but she sent me some photos of certain cuttings. So she sort of, her help a couple of years ago got me going, really. It was a sort of early starting point. to sort of digress slightly from that, when Gerald Brodrib wrote a biography of Jessop in the 1970s to coincide with the centenary of Jessop's birth, 1974, he used the Jessop scrapbooks, the family scrapbooks. But what I discovered when I sort of dug further is that actually that's all he used. So
Right.
it wasn't like
Mm.
there was he'd gone through every newspaper of the period. He'd gone through the ones that were in the cuttings books, which was comprehensive, but obviously there were others. And so when I then started researching it more broadly, I then found other cuttings that they hadn't picked up on. I mean, clearly there's a limit to how many newspapers you can lay your hands on at the time. But now, with the help of archives and the rest of it, obviously I can get to many more. So yeah, the Jessop family helped me at the start of the journey, but I then went off on my own tracks afterwards. But yes, so Jessop's granddaughter Lucy's alive, as is Jessop's daughter-in-law Pat. She married Jessop's son. He was quite old when he married her. She was quite young, so she's still alive and well, and lives in Bath, I think. But yeah, so the quite close family are still around, even though obviously Gilbert Jessop was born more than 150 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know that. I didn't realize that his daughter-in-law was still alive. That is quite a connection, and they're few and far between with players from the golden age. I'm glad there, Simon, that you mentioned a previous biography, which was written by Brodrib, which I'm sure many of my listeners would know, because your book is a welcome addition to the golden age literature, because there's really hasn't been an updated biography on Jessop really since then, 1974. So I know many people will be saying yours is a welcome addition, because your book isn't just about the famous innings. It does delve into his early life, which is what I'd like to talk to you now about. You've already mentioned he was born in 1874. He was the 11th of 12 surviving children to Henry and Susanna Jessop. What can you tell us about his early life, and how much did cricket play a role in those early years?
Well, cricket was a big part of his life from very early on. He played with his brothers and sisters in the family home in Cheltenham. They had a smallish garden with various sort of obstacles, the way that the way that family gardens do. So he played a lot with them. He loves all sorts of sports. I mean, he played rugby and football, and he was a very good sprinter. He was a good all round sportsman from a young age, really. And I don't think his parents were particularly sort of keen, didn't push him towards sport. He just naturally gravitated towards it. But he went to Cheltenham Grammar School. Gustav Holst was at Cheltenham Grammar School around the same time. We don't know much about how friendly they were, but that's quite a nice connection.
Yes.
The big event in his life was at this stage was his father Henry, who was a local surgeon, I think, died when Gilbert was 15. So Gilbert had to leave Cheltenham Grammar School. His father had been one of the governors, I think is probably the right phrase. At that time, Gilbert had to leave school as a result of his father's death. This was obviously an unfortunate event in terms of his sort of development. The family came up with a solution of him going to other schools and working as a sort of assistant teacher, really, and continuing his education in the process. But thereby, they didn't have to sort of pay for him to do so. So they came up with a sort of the best solution available. The main point about this development was that he was able to continue playing cricket as a master alongside the boys at some of the schools he went to. He moved around a bit. He worked at about 3 or 4 schools. Basically, he played an enormous amount of cricket as a young man. Also, the other key thing is, because he didn't go to one of the major public schools like Eton, Harrow, this sort of thing, he wasn't coached in the way that some of the other leading amateurs of the period were, the golden age people, heroes we'll know about. He eventually got to Cambridge, but he went there when he was maybe early 20s, so later than normal. And by that point, he had developed a way of playing that was unique to himself. And he did say, if I'd been coached properly, I wouldn't have played the way I did. So he had quite an unusual upbringing in terms of cricketing development, but it was absolutely central to how he ended up playing the game.
Yeah, fascinating. And we're going to touch on a little bit later about his unorthodox style, which many of my listeners probably already know about, a certain way he stood at the wicket. So, Simon, after the legendary W.G. Grace, Gilbert Jessop is perhaps the most famous name associated with the Gloucestershire Cricket Club, County Cricket Club, in the 19th century at least. You've talked about how he's playing a lot of cricket and how he moves around a bit. How did he eventually find his way playing for Gloucestershire?
Well, it happened quite by chance, actually. I mean, he may have got there in the end anyway, but a cousin of his, who was quite a good club cricketer, got an invitation to attend a Gloucestershire trial. His cousin couldn't go, so he suggested that Gilbert went in his place, which he did. And the match took place at the county ground in Bristol. And W.G. Grace happened to be watching. The reason he was watching, I think, was because his son was playing.
Mm-hmm.
And Gilbert Jessop ran out W.G. Grace Jr. with a brilliant piece of, athletic throw, direct hit, run out, that sort of thing. Jessop was in a phenomenal fielder. He was the best English fielder of the golden age. It was one of the reasons he got picked for a lot of teams. And W.G. Grace obviously noticed this feat of athleticism and was immediately impressed, and basically said I think Jessop had quite a good all-round game in that sort of trial. W.G. Grace said, "We've got to, this guy's got to play," and he did. And in fact, I think W.G. Grace a couple of times wrote to the schools that Jessop was working at as a teacher and said, "Please, can you give him time off, because I want him to play for Gloucestershire against Lancashire, Old Trafford, or whatever it was." And they acquiesced. So W.G. Grace had quite an important role at the outset of Jessop's career.
Yeah, interesting. Now, going from one amateur to the next, so W.G. is perhaps the most famous amateur, or shamateur, if you want to use that term, from the golden age. Jessop is listed as an amateur. I mean, that's what his standing was at the time. But can we assume that he wasn't an overly wealthy individual? Certainly with his father dying when he was only 15, I assume he didn't have all this wealth to lean back on like some of the other amateur cricketers of the day. So how did he play cricket as an amateur? Were the allowances that amateurs were granted, were that enough for him to survive on?
Yeah, he didn't. He wasn't. The family weren't wealthy. He wasn't wealthy. He described himself as a limited income amateur. In the long term, he got by ultimately becoming Gloucestershire captain in about 1901. So not long after W.G. Grace had given up, W.G. Grace went off and formed the London county, didn't he?
Yes.
Jessop took over after a couple of years sort of gap, and he captained Gloucestershire through to 1914, I think, pretty much, or more than 10 years he was captain, and he later became secretary of the club as well, which was quite a common contrivance that clubs came to with their leading amateurs. It was a way of paying them, and they gave them some sort of light administrative work involved in that needed doing around the club, but left them free to play cricket, and that was regarded as them playing as an amateur. I mean, it sounds absurd these days. I mean, if they're being paid, aren't they? But anyway, there were social niceties that needed to be observed, and certain activities were allowed which would still allow a player to remain an amateur, like writing. With journalism, they were allowed to write about the game and earn money from a newspaper, which that's something else Jessop did, and to remain an amateur. There are other jobs that would be deemed unacceptable. I mean, it was a class thing, really. If you did jobs that were respectable for a gentleman, then you were regarded as an amateur.
Yes.
If you didn't do those jobs, you were a professional. So it's all a bit silly. But towards the end of the 1901 tour of Australia, Jessop and a couple of the other English amateurs asked the Australian organisers for £50 more money each, a sort of supplement. And one of the local officials wrote to a colleague later, said, "What an ass Jessop must be to talk about letting the public of England know how the amateurs of McLaren's team have been treated. From what I saw and heard, Jessop himself would have a fine time explaining his position to the MCC authorities." So he's sort of saying Jessop has not really behaved as an amateur, as a proper amateur in the eyes of the MCC. That's the Marylebone Cricket Club back in England. And also it's clear that he's been threatening the Australian authorities with saying that they'd complain to the English public or made known their treatment to the English public if they weren't sort of given some more money. So there was obviously a slight ill feeling there about what was going on the amateurs demanding some more money. But that's sort of, Jessop's not alone in that. That was a standard issue with any English touring team to Australia. The amateurs were always asking for a bit of help with the finances, because otherwise go. And a lot of English amateurs, as you'll know from your previous discussions about this era, they couldn't go to Australia because they couldn't afford it. CB Fry never played in Australia, I mean, Jessop was typical, was not untypical of the period in terms of asking for more money, but frankly, they wouldn't have been able to play without some help from somebody.
Yes, and Stanley Jackson was another one who never made it to Australia, even though his form warranted it. But I mean, it wasn't so much, well, it was that they couldn't afford it. It's more that they couldn't afford what was back then, 6 months away. It wasn't just a fly in and fly out scenario. It was a huge undertaking. So perhaps they can be forgiven for not agreeing to give up 6 months of their time.
While you're in prosperity, remember what I say. Save a little money for a rainy day.
What was surprising reading your book, Simon, and possibly surprising to a lot of my listeners, because we know of Jessop as the great English batsman. But while I was reading your book and your description of his debut, because he debuts for England in 1899, it reminded me of how Steve Smith, Australia's Steve Smith, made his Test debut, which was as a bowler. Gilbert Jessop comes into the English team as a bowler and, as you already mentioned, an exceptional fielder. In his Test debut, he actually opens the bowling for England and he bats as low as number 8, which I think is where Steve Smith debuted as well in the batting order. So before we go on to his batting, can you briefly describe what sort of bowler Jessop was, and did he bowl throughout his entire career?
As a young man, he was a very good and effective fast bowler. I mean, he did bowl quite fast. I mean, in those days, bowlers, there were fewer out and out fast bowlers, certainly in England, because of uncovered pitches and then a bit of rain around. The rain could make the pitch quite sort of tacky and grippy. I suppose the ball would grip on it. So the art really was to make the ball cut and spin off the pitch rather than just raw pace, which would, on a sort of some of the puddingy English pitches that were uncovered, quite soft, the ball wouldn't really bounce much anyway. So it didn't. The climate, the culture of English cricket didn't really encourage raw pace. But he did bowl fast, and he charged, and he bowled quite a lot of bumpers, and that's what he was known for. He had a reputation for being a short, quite aggressive bowler. I mean, again, it's sort of the untutored thing about him, where somebody might have, if he'd gone to a public school, he might have been taught a few some subtleties, but he was like a sort of young child, really. He charged in and bowled as fast as he could, and he would, when he batted, he hit the ball as far as he could as well. That was that was how he played. So in the early years, very good bowler, batted down the order, but he developed back issues quite early. Well, say early on, not by 1899, but between 1899 and 1902, he was starting to suffer from back issues, and this contributed to him making a transition from being a bowling all-rounder to a batting all-rounder. And he was good enough to move up the order. And also at Gloucestershire, where obviously not as strong as in the England team, he would bat at 5 and bowl a lot anyway. So he was he was doing both things fully with Gloucestershire. But for England, yes, started as a bowler who batted and then moved up. I mean, in fact, in Australia, in the tour we've spoken about, he opened the batting.
Yes.
Briefly, not every match. He moved around the order quite a lot, but he was used in various positions. And in fact, earlier in the 1902 season, in the Test series, the third Test at Sheffield, he opened the batting in the second innings and scored a very quick 50. So he moved around the order a lot, but yeah, the bowling declined, and the batting didn't.
Yes, and it is quite common in the golden age and before to have that fluidity in the batting lineup. Would often depend on the weather. I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but also just there just seemed to be more all-rounders back in the 19th century, those who could bat and bowl. I will comment, Simon, looking at photos of Jessop, that he does seem to have extraordinarily long arms. There's a couple of photos of him standing in a field posing, he's holding the ball and his arms sort of extend down well below his waist. We've already spoken about what a great fielder he was, and he could probably fling the ball very, very fast, almost deceptively so for the batsman who's attempting a short single. This probably also contributed to how fast he could bowl, but as you say, he encountered back problems. So when he transitioned into becoming a full-time batsman, was he initially just a slogger at first? Was he someone who just threw the bat around?
At the outset, he was, and when his first couple of seasons with Gloucestershire, he would charge down the wicket, and he was stumped a lot. He was quite unsophisticated, really, and had quite a lot to learn. But he does describe in some of his journalism how the things he learned and how he developed, and also some of the players who played alongside him at Gloucestershire explained how he changed. And one of the things was that he learned not to charge down the wicket quite so much, and also that it wasn't advisable to always be playing cross-batted shots. Sometimes you had to play straight, and it would improve your defence if you did that. So he will learn from, I think he played in a match where Tom Hayward scored 100 for Surrey at the Oval when Jessop was playing for Gloucestershire, and he saw how technically correct he was and how straight he played, I suppose, and he got 100. Jessop realised that actually there's more than one way of doing this, more than one way of batting. And also he learned from, I think, Timothy O'Brien, played innings for Middlesex against Gloucestershire, where he cut a lot, and he picked things up as he went along. And by about maybe 1897, 98, he was starting to, I think he had a run of centuries in 1897, including 100 against Yorkshire, who were the strongest team, along with Surrey, in 40 minutes, something like that. A very fast 100 against a very good team. So he was, he evolved. It took a while, but he always had a very good eye and could hit it a long way. But he had to, against the better bowlers, he had to rein himself in a little bit, because otherwise he was just going to get out too quickly, really. So there was quite a learning curve that he went along to become the batsman he did. But ultimately he scored more than 50 centuries, first class centuries, and that's a lot for that period. So he wasn't a slogger. The people he played with said he wasn't a slogger. He was better than that. He worked out a way. I think C.B. Fry wrote about how he'd calculated the risks. Jessop had calculated the risks he could take in any situation, and made it sort of work in his favour in the end by developing certain shots and certain methods.
One of the most memorable, if not the most memorable nickname from the Golden Age is tied with Jessop, and he's known as the Croucher. And this is a nickname that was prevalent during his playing days. Your book describes this transition that he makes. He actually changes his batting style, probably because he's noticing that batting is going to be his forte from here on end. Anyone who's seen a photo and there are some beautiful photos from this era of Jessop batting. He's got this sort of curved back where he's really crouching over his overall stance at the wicket. Your book goes into detail how he does this consciously in the late 1890s. Can you just take us through this and also what he did in terms of changing his grip?
Yeah, quite a few people spoke about his grip on the bat and where he positioned his hands. He had made the bats he used were especially made for him. He had longer handles than was normal, and shorter blades. And in fact, the bat that he used in the Oval Test match 1902 still exists. It's when I saw it, it was in a museum in Bristol at the County Ground, although I think it actually belongs to the MCC now and lives at Lord's most of the time. But I was allowed to get hold of it, pick it up, measure it, etc. And I compared it to a bat that was used by Harry Brook in the Champions Trophy in February, and measured the Harry Brook bat. And apart from the fact that Harry Brook bat is much deeper front to back, as modern bats are huge, aren't they?
Yes.
And the old school bats were very thin, really. So it's the Harry Brook bat is much deeper, but also the blade is longer and the handle shorter. So Jessop's bats are different from even today's bats in terms of the handle. So he used the handle. He liked a long handle so he could move his hands up and down more, and depending on what shot he was playing, get more whip, if you like. But the stance was a thing that he developed reasonably early on, I think, and he liked to get his eye. It was almost like he was getting a sighter of the ball. He wanted to get his eyes eye line below the height of the ball. I mean, I've compared it. The only player I can think of who does something similar was Owen Morgan, obviously left-hander, but when he played for England, particularly in his sort of Test career around 2010, Owen Morgan used to bob down as the ball was being bowled. He got very low, and I think Jessop was the same. He'd sort of ducked down. It was just a way of getting a sight of the ball, I think, and the feel of it, or the length maybe, and stuff like that. Not exactly sure why he did it, but I think it's along those lines, similar to Owen Morgan. And that's what he became known for. He crouched in a way that nobody else did. Again, the old sort of training or coaching, which was, there was a correct way to do it in those days, and a lot of people followed that. You would have seen the amateurs standing up tall. There's pictures of photographs of McLaren standing up, like a sentry almost,
yes,
as he's waiting for the ball. Well, Jessop was very different. So he would have stood out for being very different from the other players, and particularly the other amateurs, perhaps, that he played alongside. So, yeah, he was known as the croucher.
If you're enjoying this podcast, perhaps you'd like to support it by buying me, Tom Ford, a coffee. Every little donation helps with the production costs and also inspire me to keep going. You can support by donating as little as $5. Visit buymeacoffee.com/Golden Age of Cricket.
I couldn't stand more a trifling man.
So, Simon, before we approach the famous 1902 Ashes series, we've touched on it already. He toured Australia for the 1901-02 summer, but he hasn't really established himself. He's transitioning between being a bowler and a batsman. I think on that 1901-02 tour, he fails to score more than 35 in any of the Test innings. So how do you evaluate where he is at this point in time? Is he a bit unreliable in the eyes of the selectors?
Yes, he is. And the selectors were unconvinced as to whether he was worth his place in the team. And also the selection panels obviously changed, and the way the team was picked was not as maybe organised as it is today. And it would change from summer to summer, winter to winter. So different people were having different views. But he was not trusted by some people at all. So they just thought, well, is he a batsman? Is he a bowler? Why are we picking him? And that was a bit of a struggle. But Archie McLaren, who captained the 1901-2 tour, he was a fan of Jessop's. And
Yes.
he got Jessop on the tour, and Jessop played all 5 Test matches on that trip. But in later times, other people, like even ironically Stanley Jackson, who would share a big partnership with Jessop at the Oval in 1902, he was a skeptic, and when he was captain of the England team later, 1905, he wasn't so keen on Jessop, and he only picked him in one Test of that series. So it sort of depended who was having a say in selection. But yeah, he was mistrusted. But the one thing everyone agreed on was he was a phenomenal fielder, and English cricket didn't have that many good fields. George Hurst was another good fielder, but there were a lot of donkeys in the field, frankly, and they couldn't. And if Jessop or Hurst didn't play, they could look pretty slow, and this became an issue in the 1902 series. But so there were good reasons for picking Jessop, but you had to find a spot for him in the team, and it wasn't always easy.
And perhaps it's even more interesting, fascinating to consider him as the best fielder in the team, considering he was an amateur. It's probably something that wasn't often attributed to the amateurs, who would rather not be standing in the field and rather be batting, but conjecture, I suppose. So, Simon, let's now talk about the 1902 Ashes series, very famous. So it's off the back just a few months after the completion of the 1901-02 series in Australia, which the Australians win 4-1. So the Australians then arrive in England, led by Joe Darling for the second time. He's leading a tour. What can you tell us about the Australian bowling squad? I'm just trying to set the scene of the pace attack or the bowlers that Jessop would have faced. So looking at the bowlers on tour for the Australians, there's some big names: Hugh Trumbull, Ernie Jones, Jack Saunders, Monty Noble, and Warwick Armstrong. What do you make of that makeup?
Well, going into the series, it was thought that Ernie Jones, who was the fastest bowler in Australia, would play a role. But in fact, because the pitches it was a very wet summer, and the pitches were quite soft and unresponsive, Jones didn't feature very much. And by the time we get to the back end of the series, he's not in the team. So Ernie Jones was thought to be a threat, but it didn't actually happen. So he didn't feature much. Hugh Trumbull was a great bowler. He had a great mastery of cut and swerve, and all spin and all that sort of stuff. He was tall. He could hit the pitch. He was very skillful, and he was a big threat, and he took a lot of wickets. I mean, by the time he retired, I think he'd got 141 wickets against England.
Yes.
And that stood as a record for right through to Dennis Lilly's time, I think. So, he was a great bowler. Jack Saunders was a left arm spinner, cutter, sort of medium. But I mean, he probably brisker than what we'd regard as a left arm spinner. He'd be a bit quicker than that, but he was cutting and spinning the ball. He was slightly controversial because there were some question marks about his action, whether it was legitimate or not. But there was a sort of whispers rather than never developed into a major row. But there was some suspicion that maybe it wasn't quite as pure as it could have been. He also had a strange way of approaching the crease. He'd come across and behind the umpire, or even in front of the umpire, depended where the umpire stood. And in fact, I think during the Oval Test, one of the umpires was moved back so that because I think the batsman complained that they couldn't see Saunders. He'd sort of come from behind the bowler, behind the umpire, and then bowl, and they didn't like it, and they complained, and the umpire went back a bit. So he was an unusual bowler in method, and he caused a lot of problems in the Oval Test and in earlier games of that series. Monty Noble, another great bowler, would take over 100 Test wickets. He was the man who invented swerve bowling, or swing bowling as we'd call it. George Hurst of England picked up on what Noble did and learned from him. S.F. Barnes learnt from Monty Noble. He could make the ball swerve through the air, and then when it pitched, he would cut the other way. So he was a pioneer, really. He was a great bowler. And then Warwick Armstrong, quite a young player at this point, obviously would be still captaining Australia in the 1920s, but he's a youngster here, and he bowled leg spin, and he was used in the Jessop innings eventually to try and stop him scoring because Australia were running out of ideas. So I mean, these are all significant figures in a way, and they all have pretty good Test records. They were not some. It wasn't a poor attack at all. It was a very good attack.
And as you say, Armstrong is only young at this point, and it wasn't until the following tour in 1905 that he employs leg theory, much to the chagrin of the English crowds. Bowling ball after ball down leg side, which some fans say may have inspired a certain English captain 3 decades later, but we won't go into that now. But yes, a very good bowling lineup. So Simon, let's talk through some of the early tests. I won't go into too much detail now. We just want to set the scene leading into the 5th test at the Oval. So the first test at Edgbaston and the second test at Lords are both drawn. Jessop contributes little in terms with the bat or ball. The third test match is at Bramall Lane in Sheffield, which is the only test to have ever been played at that ground. He performed slightly better here, even though the Australians ultimately won the match. It's quite unusual looking at the scorecard. He batted at number 9 in the first innings for 12 runs. This is Jessop. And then strangely, this is what I love about the Golden Age, he then opens the batting for England in the second innings. What can you tell us about that scenario?
Well, England had been in the field for quite a while that day. So we're talking about the second day of a 3-day match. And when they came off after the Australian innings had finally ended, either Jessop noticed that Archie McLaren was looking weary, or maybe Archie McLaren said he was feeling weary, but Jessop volunteered to go in to open rather than McLaren. There was about an hour till stumps, so it was a sort of dangerous period maybe for England. They could lose a few wickets if things went wrong, and Jessop volunteered to go in and open rather than McLaren, and perhaps protect some wickets, for the next day. England were England were chasing something like 339, well over 300, which is a huge score. In fact, what's interesting, given the Oval Test of 1902, was and England chasing in the fourth innings, that England had actually gone through a number of run chases in the fourth innings in the sort of previous 12 months against Australia, and then during this series in 1902, and this was one of them, chasing over 300, big score. And Jessop, having said, "I'll go in and sort of look after you," he then went out and smashed the ball to all parts and scored 53 in an hour before stumps. So that was his way of protecting the team. So he caused a bit of havoc. England lost only 1 wicket in that period. I think there was 73 for 1 at stumps, maybe. And Jessop was 53 not out. So what had looked like a very difficult target, he'd actually brought it down by quite a lot by stumps. And so, of course, at the start of day 3, the English public and the players probably were quite excited about their chances of actually winning the match, because he'd given them such a great start. But sadly, he was out in the next morning to Hugh Trumbull quite early on, and England actually subsided, and they lost by quite a long way in the end. So it was a quite decisive victory for Australia. But Jessop had given them hope, and also he'd given himself a lot of confidence, I imagine, that he'd actually scored some runs against this attack, and maybe just also warn the Australians that they needed to be careful with Jessop, because if he got going, he could cause them problems. So it was like a little bit of a taster for what was to come at the Oval in that game.